Hey everybody. For this video, I want to talk about the sample essay that I had given you to read for this week. It's posted under the current week on Moodle sample essay there for you. I will say that I would prefer it if you guys posted in the discussion thread about sample essay before reading this video. Just so I don't taint your ideas and opinions, so I can see what people think. So I would go and post in that discussion thread before watching. But yeah, I thought I would just give you some of my thoughts about a few things. I feel like this essay did well. Probably some more things that I don't think it did well. I don't know. I don't think this is a bad essay. I think it's solid. It's probably right in there, right in the B range somewhere. Where like a lot of student essays I read, I feel like there's a kernel of something very interesting, of like a really good thesis. I think it's there, but it's just not quite explained enough or brought out into the light enough to be like an A level essay. Okay, so this one, obviously this was the poetry essay. This is from a couple years ago, a student's essay they submitted for the poetry essay assignment. So again, I didn't want to have us look at one about M butterfly and stuff because again, that might corrupt our own ideas. So I thought we would look at an example from the last essay that we did. All right, so let's get into this. One thing that I kind of like with this first paragraph, I feel like they come close to making a really interesting point about the poem Harlem. So this is a few sentences in. It says, in the poem by Hughes, he explains the whole civil rights movement in such a little poem. The way he explains it is by saying there are three different points of view to it all: the peaceful way, the violent way, and the waiting way. I like this. My comment here, I underlined where he wrote three different points, and I wrote specific with an exclamation point, because I think that right there they do a really good job of being super specific about like what they see the poem doing. They're like, the poem's doing these three different things. It's showing us how do they put it? The peaceful way, the violent way, and the waiting way. So that's kind of an interesting argument, saying that Harlem kind of encapsulates these three different positions that people could take to the civil rights movement. I don't know if I totally agree with that, but that's fine. I don't have to agree with the argument. As long as it's a well-made argument, it can still be a very successful essay. But I feel like they didn't do enough to make this like the central thesis. Um, so they also talk about this other poem. This isn't a poem that we read. I just didn't have time with doing the online version. I didn't have enough time to include this poem. But they're talking about this other poem, If We Must Die, right? So I liked their kind of argument about Harlem, at least the way that they laid it out in this first paragraph. But by the end of the first paragraph, I felt like we needed a clearer thesis that explained how the two poems they mentioned, Harlem and then this other poem, what is it? If We Must Die, right? Yeah. If We Must Die. If you're going to talk about both of those poems, you need a thesis that explains what the argument is, that and how both of those poems fit into your overall argument. You need one unifying argument that brings together what you're going to say about all the poems that you're going to talk about, right? So at the end of the first paragraph, I ended up writing that I thought a clearer thesis was needed, and yeah, what is the unifying argument that ties both of these poems together? So but yeah, I do really like the part where they say, oh well, the poem Harlem, it shows us these three different things. They're very specific about that. That's I'm sure if you've read my comments on drafts or essays, one of the things I'm always harping on is be as specific as you can, because it makes the argument more interesting. It makes the argument more debatable, and I think it just gives us a better thesis at the end of the day. So there you go. There's some thoughts on the first paragraph there. Um, Something that I think I marked a few times throughout this essay is I think they had some trouble with introducing the quotes that they use. So if you remember back that, I did some videos a while ago about the idea of introducing the quote and then explaining the quote, right? So I'm looking on page 2 here, kind of midway through the paragraph. This author writes, They say, I also think Hughes is trying to address ways to fix this problem too. He's saying there are two ways to do so, the peaceful way and the violent way. There are two people that perfectly define that. Those heroes are Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And then it goes into a quote, or fester like a sore. And they go on. What I think Hughes is trying to say is that the sore hurts, but only when you put pressure on it, and that's what defines Martin Luther King's way of protesting. Um, so I think they need a more way to introduce that or fester like a sore quote. It feels like it's just dropped in out of nowhere, like it just kind of falls out of the sky, you know. Um, so they could have said, one line in the poem that I think connects to Martin Luther King is "or fester like a sore" or whatever, and then they can make their argument about it. But that just stuck out to me as a place where more introduction of a quote was needed, just so it flows within the paragraph, you know? As a reader, I think, like, I just kind of felt thrown off at that point. And, like, anything that makes your reader, like, fall out of the rhythm and the flow of your writing is not what we want. So I thought they could have done more to introduce the quote there. I also didn't fully get their explanation here when they say, about this line, or fester like a sore. Um, I think that the rest of it's fester like a sore and then run is the rest of it. And they say, what I think he was trying to say is that the sore hurts you, but only when you put pressure on it, and that's what defines Martin Luther King's way of protesting. That would have to be explained a lot more. Like, I'm interested in this idea that, um, the poem somehow relates to Martin Luther King's ideas about how to achieve societal change. I'm open to that argument, but I just think that they would have had to explain it a lot more here if I was really going to be convinced by it. Like, how does a sore, if the sore festering is like Martin Luther King, trying to put pressure on the leaders of cities to change their laws? I don't know. I didn't quite get it there. So I wanted that to be explained more. Because then they immediately move on. The next sentence it says, on the other hand, there was the violent way, or does it explode? And then they start talking about Malcolm X. So they really only give one sentence of explanation there. And, it's a big claim to try to connect that quote to Martin Luther King's political ideology. That takes a lot of work to really make that stick. So I think they needed at least a few more sentences there. And maybe they could have even reorganized this paragraph. So they had one paragraph about how Harlem connects in certain ways to Martin Luther King's ideologies, and maybe a separate paragraph that shows how the poem can also connect to Malcolm X's ideology, or how certain parts of it does. Because I like that idea that, like, okay, the poem in some ways it fits with MLK, in some ways it fits with Malcolm X. I think that's an interesting way to look at it. But it just would have had to be more organized, further explained. They probably had more quotes to back it up if we were going to really make this argument. So there's just another thing I wanted to mark. Okay, this next paragraph, the one on page 3 that starts out, is it more effective to use violence? This whole paragraph, I just felt like needed a lot more historical context. I think the student here was relying a lot on these commonplace historical narratives that Martin Luther King was successful and MLK, that Martin Luther King was successful and Malcolm X wasn't. And I just don't think it was historically grounded. I think they needed more research in this paragraph, even though they have one quote from a source. I don't think that quote really even connected to the point they were trying to make with it that much. But they needed more research here, and something I've been trying to say all semester, and one of the difficulties of writing these kinds of essays is that we're never just writing about the poem. We're never just writing about the play or the story. There's always like a topic we're connecting it to. In the short story essay, we were mostly writing about gender. So you not only need to know the things that happen in the story and stuff, you also had to have some knowledge about gender and sexism and patriarchy and stuff on its own so that you can make these connections, right? And it's one of the reasons that I've spent so much time trying to talk about, historical time periods throughout the semester, is that you need some of this background knowledge to connect the pieces of writing to, or else we wouldn't have a lot to say about them, or else the messages that the texts are sending wouldn't really make sense to us. So I think in this paragraph, they just needed to do some more research, or even maybe read a little bit more closely some of the essays that I assigned. Like for instance, they say in like the third sentence here, King faced many obstacles while in the process of trying to get freedom for all. He never resorted to act of violence, and this is why I believed it worked. So I underlined it worked, and I wrote, did it? Because I think a lot of the historical stuff that we looked at during that unit with the poetry essay were things about how the civil rights movement isn't really this moment of triumph that you know general like histories like grade school history books try to tell us that it was. So I don't think the student was really engaging enough with like the history of the thing. One other quote that made me think this. The writer says here that MLK maintained a level of respect compared to the party who just kept on taking low blows. He kept on fighting until people realized he wasn't a traitor as defined by the United States, but just simply a black man wanting change and equality for all people. Um, the part that I took an issue with here, Martin Luther King kept on fighting until people realized he wasn't a traitor. And I'm like, well, when did that happen? Like one of the things I tried to talk about a lot with the history of the time period was, how many Americans really did not approve of what Martin Luther King was doing at the time he was doing it, and I think the idea that people realized that he wasn't a traitor, I don't think that happened until after his death, and probably not till decades after his death. When I think the U.S. government saw the opportunity to make him a kind of saint of America, that could still try to like make America look good or whatever. But anyway, the point here is that I think this paragraph on the second page, or sorry, the third page, shows us the importance of research, the importance of doing more research than is required sometimes. Because again, if we're going to talk about this stuff, we need to reach like a certain level of competency on the topic. So, like for M. Butterfly, if you're writing about stereotypes or you're writing about art and this kind of stuff, you need some information on those topics. You might want to find some articles just on the topic itself and how that works, and then sync that up with your analysis of the play itself. I think is the lesson we can take away from looking at that paragraph here. One other kind of unfortunate thing that happened in this essay, the author a couple of times uses the phrase colored people, and I think that they were trying to say people of color, but they just got mixed up. And I've seen this happen with students too, where I'll have them read something that was written in the 50s, and they'll use, and then in the thing we're reading, they'll use one kind of way of referring to groups of people or whatever, but it's just outdated. It's just not a thing that we say anymore, and in fact, it could probably come off pretty offensive. So something like saying colored people instead of people of color, we want to be careful about that, right? You want to make sure that even if we're reading, like how in M. Butterfly, that they use the term Oriental a number of times, not a term we want to use in our own, unless we're quoting from it or something like that. We still want to try to use the less offensive terms in our own writing. So that was just something unfortunate with this essay that I wanted to mention. One more instance here where I thought they needed to do more to introduce a quote is in this next paragraph on page 4. At the start of this paragraph, they say, although he didn't use extreme violence, it was enough to very strongly get the point across. And then they go into a quote, press us to wall, dying, but fight back. And it's like, I just don't know, where is that quote from? And then we find out with the citation, we might know where it's from. And after the quote, they say, this quote by Claude McKay very strongly relates to Malcolm X. I kind of feel like that sentence, or like a version of that sentence, maybe should have came before the quote, just so we knew what was happening, so the reader could feel like grounded and feel like they're following what's going on and stuff. So I think that was just another case where it feels like a quote was just kind of dropped out of the heavens, and something that we wanted to avoid. I think that's the main thing. The conclusion paragraph here is meh. It's whatever. It's basically just trying to summarize all the things that they've said so far. And I've tried to tell you guys that I think it can be better, instead of just summarizing the things that you say. Maybe you refer to your thesis again in the conclusion. But really, you want to try to tell us about like the bigger picture of all this, or like what it means now, or how the reader should think about things differently now that they've read your essay, or what like the takeaway is for them as they return to their life? Like, what is the thing you really want them to remember, and the thing that you want them to be influenced by now that they've finished reading your essay? So yeah, overall this was so. Maybe something like a B minus, maybe a regular B if I was feeling generous. I don't know. I don't remember the grade I gave it exactly, but I think this is like an average kind of paper, and I think that it could have been a lot better if they would have taken that the point that they made about Harlem in the first paragraph, that it shows us, the three different points of view of the civil rights movement. I think there's a kernel of a really interesting argument in there, but they just didn't expand it, and they went down some other paths, and I think kind of got sidetracked on some other things that didn't really work as well. I think that this essay could have benefited from more organization. I think that my guess would be that they didn't make an outline, especially like the whole paragraph that I was talking about, where it's just talking about like the history of it and Martin Luther King and stuff. Like, what really is the point of that paragraph? How does that paragraph help me better understand the poems? How does it advance the argument? I'm not totally sure. So I think this sample essay can be another place for me to pitch the idea of coming up with an outline where you sort of have some bullet points of what the main ideas of each of your paragraphs are going to be, maybe some quotes that you're going to use in each paragraph, and I think that'll help you to write a longer essay, like I've talked about before. Also, make it feel like it flows better because your paragraphs are like organized, and you put them in an order that is logical and stuff. So, yes, I think those are my big takeaways. Main things, as always, we want to make sure that we have a thesis that makes a clear argument about the text. What does M. Butterfly show us about stereotypes? Specifically, you want to answer these questions as specifically as you can. What does it show us about stereotypes? What does it show us about art and how it functions in society? And your thesis, again, as specific as you could possibly be. All right, I think that's all I'll say about this sample. And hopefully we can pick up some lessons here that'll help us as we work on writing our final essay this semester. All right, more videos coming on Wednesday. I'll see you soon.